When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to the blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hi, this is Steve Huff from School of Two Swords and Creative Combat, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, this next guest is an accomplished martial artist who has over a decade of experience in both performing, choreography, and directing action sequences. Originally from the East Coast, but now based in LA. This next guest has experience and interest in history and a fascination with knights and fantasy that has led to learning European weaponry as well as early American history and weaponry. He runs the School of Two Swords in LA, which focuses on various forms of historical Western martial arts. And there's just so much to get into. This gentleman is a friend of Mr. Fick from Davernrich European Martial Arts School. So why don't we go ahead and welcome Mr. Steve Huff. So, Mr. Huff, how are things for you? Obviously, I know it's been nuts for everybody with the fires and such. But how is things in your world?
Uh, yeah, it was pretty tense there for a while. Luckily, I was okay. I was on standby, car packed, cat ready to go for a couple of days, which is kind of nerve-wracking. But all in all, it was ended up being okay. And things are slowly, coming back online. Work's starting to pick back up. It's actually been a crazy week for me getting back into work, so that's why it took a while to schedule.
So, yeah, that's totally understandable for scheduling and everything else like that for real life stuff that was going on. So, curious to know, this is more, I guess, on the personal side as well. How did you get connected with Steven from Devon Rich?
So I've known him uh, about 20 years or so now. We were both instructors at the International Sword Fighting and Martial Arts Convention, ISMAC, or as he always liked to call it, ISMAC.
Yeah, that sounds about right with him.
Yeah, and again, it was the same thing that became Combat Con, where it was just a bunch of different instructors from around the world teaching different things. And he had been with them for a couple of years at that point. And I mean, it was a lot of the guys: John Lennox, Paul McDonald over in Edinburgh, Jared Kirby, Tim Rizuki. So a lot of these guys. From the Western martial arts community at the time, and I was kind of the new guy. And I was teaching with John Lennox, Doc. We were doing the maritime weaponry class, and Dav had signed up to be a student in it. So we went through the basic, like, first few hours of the fundamentals and all of that, and we were talking about, well, when we get to sparring and get to sparring, get to sparring. And during one of the breaks, he was like, "So you do a lot of sparring with this?" I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "You guys like go full speed and all that?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, would you be willing to go around with me?" And I was like, "Well, sure." And he kind of looked at me because he's like twice my size.
Hmm.
And he's like, I don't know, I go pretty hard. I'm like, okay. So he came in with the cutlass. I had the two-handed boarding axe, and we were geared up, and we were using training weapons, wooden axe, steel but blunted cutlass. And he came in, and I ended up blocking the attack and hitting him and pressing him back. But I ended up hitting him so hard that it surprised him, first of all, but he went back and he hit the rail. Well, we were doing this class on an actual ship. We were on a riverboat, the Michigan Princess. And he hit the rail and it creaked. And for a second, we both thought he was going to go over. So I saw both the look of surprise and then, like, shock for a second that he thought he was going to go over. And then he was okay. And then we were talking about it. And I actually used that as an example later on to talk about how had it been a ship of the line at the time, he probably would have been in the water because they were a little lower. And that was how we first met. And then, we discussed it later, at the pub over a few pints. And he's been one of my closest friends ever since.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, some of the stories he tells over a cocktail or two, and and when I was just recently out there, he was sharing some stories of different faux pas, we'll say, but also learning lessons. That's for sure. Uh,
We've had some times. We had a knife fight in a waterfall in Shenandoah over in Virginia, which is another, like, just epic time.
you're giving me more material to dig on there, on the other side there. But I heard you're an East Coast guy. Where exactly are you from? I'm in Philly.
Well, I grew up in Maryland,
Okay.
Southern Maryland, and then I'm in LA now. Moved out here about 12 years ago,
Okay.
but grew up, grew up on the East Coast my whole life.
Yeah.
Wandered here and there a bit, but always ended up back there.
Nice. So, where did the interest in history and fascination with things like knights and fantasy and stuff like that come from?
So, like a lot of people that I found that like Kyle Rowling's another good friend of ours that's into this. Um, growing up as kids in the '70s, it was Star Wars and D&D.
Yeah.
I mean that was it for me, really. I grew up in Star Wars. Yeah, it's sci-fi, but it's also fantasy. So it's kind of like it kind of whet my appetite for both genres. And then when I got into fantasy stuff and all of that, then my older brother played D&D, and I was like kind of seeing the books that he had and all of that. And then I got old enough to start playing that. Both of those kind of led me down the path. With Star Wars, I always wanted to learn how to use a lightsaber, and uh, the closest thing that we ever found when I was a kid, was martial arts. Um, so that kind of gave me my fascination with weapons. It went from having a painted broomstick that my dad made for me, swinging that around in the backyard, to actually learning how to do different weapons. Uh, and then I had also at the time kind of gotten into Bruce Lee movies and all of that through my older brother and all of that. So that led into an interest in martial arts in general. But was always fascinated with weapons, going back to the lightsabers, and then with D&D, all the weapons in there. That led to wanting to learn more about knights and all of that. And I just found that history kind of always clicked for me. Math, probably my worst subject ever. I'm glad phones have calculators now. So yeah, but history was always something that I was just kind of interested in, and it kind of went hand in hand with the weapons studies. As I got older, the cultures behind the weapons kind of interested me. It's like, well, this weapon in this style is very similar to this weapon in this style. Why are they that close? And then it's like, started making me look at the different cultures and all of that. So then I started looking at martial arts beyond just like their combative roles, but kind of in as their role in society,
Mhm.
and and history overall, like a very kind of, I guess, hyper specialized role in military history, I guess, like martial archaeology, looking at why did different fighting styles evolve, why are the core mechanics the same, and then why are they different. And that was kind of what became my interest uh, in my late teens, early 20s to now.
Yeah, because I had read, and we know everything online is true, that I guess during college time period, picked up on American history and weaponry, as you said, and things like the tomahawk and all that fun stuff. But it was funny because I asked about the knights there, and I was out at Stephen's school, and my nephew called me, video called me at one point. He was like, he's 5, and he goes, so I was showing him the weapon room in the back there, and obviously he's got the knights on statues and all that stuff, or the knight uniform, I should say. Uh, Best way to explain it. And he goes, my nephew, being how kids are, goes, that's not real. I said, yeah, the armor's real. That's not a real person under it. Yeah, I told you it wasn't real. It's like, oh, jeez. All right. Yeah, you're right. It's not real, buddy. So.
Yeah, he's got such an amazing collection, and then to see
Oh,
him
it's
move the way he can when he's wearing it, it's pretty impressive.
absolutely. So, School of Two Swords. You focus on or I should say, and creative combat as well. You focus on fight choreography and action design. and stuff like that. Where did that start? When did you start going that direction?
So again, it goes back to being a kid, loving movies and watching so many movies and especially the sci-fi and fantasy genres, and then doing a lot of the reading and history. I also was always kind of drawn to theater, but never really had the guts to do theater. I was always kind of very shy and withdrawn as a kid, and then definitely wasn't theater material when I was in high school. But it was always kind of something that I had wished I had gotten more into. Going to the Renaissance fairs, watching the shows and things like that. I was always like, I know how to use the weaponry. I wish I had done, something more fun with it. And then it was just one of those things that was always kind of hanging there, one of those what ifs. And, like I had the martial arts background and I did a bunch of stuff. And then I was like, what if I had gone out and done, tried my hand in the stunt industry. And then, next thing you know, you're looking back and you're in your 30s. And I went through a major life change, the end of a marriage, looking at resetting my life anyway. And I was just kind of getting burnt out on my career at the time. And I kept thinking, what if? And then an opportunity happened to come up with a friend of mine who was in New York, who was kind of feeling the same way. He had a financial backer willing to invest in us trying to start a business out here. And what if became, why not?
Exactly. Well, before I go more into the choreograph stuff and current things that learned about last night, there was a gentleman, and I'm not familiar with him, Colonel Dwight McClure. Where did you come across him and his system? And could you actually explain that system a little bit?
Yes. So Colonel Dwight McLemore is considered one of the grandfathers of the whole Western martial arts movement. He was one of the first people to really delve deep into looking at fighting styles where there weren't really any existing manuals or treatises that had been written, that were more instinctive fighting styles rather than codified systems. And because of his martial background and his knowledge base going into it already, a lot of the historians and martial artists alike really respected his findings and all of that. And he had started really focusing on what were some of the fighting styles in the Americas, mainly during the colonization period. And I actually met him while attending a workshop put on by Ramon and Jeanette Martinez, the two maestri from New York, and the Martinez Academy of Arms. They were giving a rapier seminar. And I had been there for the seminar, and then Sunday was the tournament. And I had made it to the semifinals. And then I was actually fighting for third place, and the colonel was my opponent. So not only was I intimidated because he was this, well-known, well-respected martial artist who is, well known to gear up and step into the ring, but he was also 6'3", and I'm 5'7", and it was a rapier.
So you get that whole reaching up,
right?
Yeah.
So it was it was quite the pairing. But because I knew he was a knife guy, I ended up closing distance with him, and it basically turned into a dagger fight. And I ended up getting a lucky shot on him, and then we were talking afterwards. He invited me down for a workshop that he was going to be having the following month on Bowie knife, invited me to stay with him. I went down. That turned into the occasional weekend, turned into almost every weekend, to the point where it developed into a father-son relationship. And when he passed, his system came over to me. So basically, what the School of Two Swords philosophy is, the reason he named it that was the whole idea of uh, doing many things. And, basically he also believed in, like a lot of Bruce Lee's writings and all of that. He had a very deep understanding of Eastern and Western martial and philosophical culture. He studied both very, very deeply. Um, so he always kind of was able to view it from different angles and view each separately, but then also see where the similarities are and all of that. So he put a lot of time and research into a lot of these systems, looking at ancient combatives such as gladiatorial combat. Like, we have a lot of research on the weapons, the gear, how they lived, what they ate. New archaeological studies done on bone examples that give us their diet. So we know what they look like. We know pretty much everything, but exactly their martial systems. There's a little bit of information out there, but then he basically started applying the principle that the human body can only move in so many ways. If you look at different martial systems throughout history, cultures that never influenced each other, if they have two similar weapons, take the katana and the longsword, they're fundamentally they're different weapons, but at their core, the principles, they're going to move in a similar fashion. And that's because the human body can only move in so many ways. That's why you see so many similarities when it comes to the fundamentals of martial arts, whether they're Eastern, Western, whatever. Even in dance, you'll see a lot of similar properties when you're talking about establishing balance, footwork, that type of understanding what are those core mechanics. He had a very, very strong understanding of those principles. He even had a gymnastics background, which a lot of people don't know, is how he went to college initially. So he really understood movement, but he also understood fighting theory like no one I've ever met. And, I have been lucky enough to meet and talk and train with some of the greatest in the world. And even they say they just, the way he viewed things was incredible. So that was his approach in looking at a lot of these systems. And then he started developing a logical progression for people that are interested in training in those systems. He put together a suggested idea of how he felt it most likely was. He never said this is exactly how it is, because he used to say the only thing we know for certain about history is that we don't know anything for certain, right? So everything we get comes from a different source, unless somebody is going to show up, and I know like that hurts some of the WMA HEMA crowd out there when they talk about, well, we've got the different masters, the Talhofer and all that. I'm like, well, yeah, but even though they wrote stuff down, unless they specifically come to us today and say, well, this is what I meant, we're giving it our best guess. Now, there are those out there that have a certain set of skills where their best guess is far more likely than somebody just picking up the weapon, swinging it around, and saying, this is most likely what it was. So it's sort of like an experimental archaeological approach. And, he bases it on years of research and all of that. And then gearing up with simulators that can come as close as you can to the real deal, and fighting. And, he would say, if the shit either works or it doesn't.
Yeah. Or I would say, too, you made me think of when you say somebody picks something up and just willy-nilly. Reminds me of somebody who told me a story of so you're going to be like pokey, pokey, pokey. No, that's not how this works. you know? So, how do you mix both the European mindset to the Western mindset? Because obviously, when I talk European, it's like you mentioned earlier, rapier, the longsword, things like that. But also, there's the Western side things too that you've learned as well for close quarter combats and things like that. So, how do you try to mesh the two?
So one of the things that I think drew the Colonel and I together was we were both very interested in like that idea of cultural migration. Where you do see different historical fighting arts travel into new areas and create new fighting systems. Filipino martial arts is a perfect example because you have originally an Eastern country, but now the language is intermingled with Spanish and all of that. Even their martial arts are the same because you have an indigenous fighting style meeting with the colonial styles with sword and dagger and rapier and dagger and all of that. So you see kind of a blend there. You also see that same influence with Portuguese sailors in the areas outside of mainland Japan where they were able to do a little bit of trading. You start to see that little bit of migration, and you kind of start to see these new fighting styles develop. And then when you come over into America, there's again indigenous fighting styles here where they're using weapons that are not completely dissimilar to what's being brought over by traders. Like the tomahawk is a prime example. With what we did with the tomahawk was we started looking at its evolution during the prime era of colonization. Looking at how do we go from the Eastern war clubs to the metal-headed tomahawk. So here you have Western culture coming into even far Western culture, and so that same blend is happening where you're going to see the same types of crossover where you look at the people that are coming over and what have they trained with. You're going to have a lot of militiamen who probably had some training with backsword. They might have some officers who might have some rapier training, especially during the French and Indian War and the Revolution. We know that a lot of officers carried small sword. So you start to see those coming in. And then you're seeing the migration of those fighting systems with those coming over. They're in Colonial Williamsburg. They have, I think they have one of Angelo's old fencing manuals, small sword fencing manuals down there. It was found in one of the collections. So you see that same type of idea where it's coming in. And then you have a difference in like the Native American approach to combat where it's more fluid, where it's more of a guerrilla type of warfare, encountering the European mindset then, which was very rank and file. But then you start to see people living along the frontiers where they're kind of blending. They're Europeans that are kind of starting to adopt and adapt a lot of the native lifestyle because it's just a lot more effective there. And that includes adopting, like getting rid of longer weapons for shorter things. And then the tomahawk becomes a main trade weapon. In fact, the term tomahawk isn't even really a Native American term. It's an anglicized pronunciation of an Algonquin word, which is Otomahawk, which is basically like the stone-headed war club, but also the ball-headed war club. And it's just a matter of them seeing the metal belt-headed hatchets and small, trade axes, basically, and applying their word to it, and then it became tomahawk. So you see this migration of fighting theories meeting coming from people that have like a military background and maybe not direct, but again, a lot of the people living on the frontier, they had some kind of military service or had fought at some point. A lot of them were also Scottish and Germanic settlers. So it's two cultures that are well known to have an affinity for the axe, and dirks and like longer fighting knives. So you see that cultural migration bringing those weapons in, but now they're blending with a whole new culture with different fighting ideas. So that's kind of how you start to see these things mesh.
Well, speaking of which, there's this thing apparently in print, rumor has it, uh, by Sword and Tomahawk, written by yourself
Yes.
and two other authors. So, how did that come about?
So it was written by it's me, John Lennox, and Gareth Thomas. And when I very first came into the whole uh, scene as an instructor, I actually had come with the colonel to one of the early ISMAC events, and I had taken a class that John and Gareth were teaching on the cutlass. And during the Q&A, somebody had said, well, how does it do against different weapons? And they were talking about that. And then somebody said, well, what if they have an axe? And so I kind of perked up, and then they kind of looked at me. They were like, hey, do you have any of your tomahawks? Because they had met me earlier and they knew that I was training with the colonel. And then came in, we did a couple of real quick exchanges with the tomahawk against the cutlass, threw out a couple of ideas, and then agreed to meet at the pub later that night and started talking. And it was that night that organization, the Historical Maritime Combat Association, was born, which was sort of an offshoot and a very specialized field where we wanted to hyper focus on what were the actual martial techniques most likely used in a boarding action. Again, it was a situation where we had tons of material about what happens during a boarding action and how they go up to the boarding action, but then it's usually, and they boarded, shots were fired, a little bit of details. So what we did was we started getting as many accounts as we could get, especially surgeons' reports. We started looking at where were the wounds occurring and then how were they happening, because they would list them out, Ableman, able-bodied seaman, blah, 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 cutlass wound above the left eye, so many pounds, right? Whatever. So lost an ear, boarding axe, whatever. And so we started documenting that. And that's why it took 15 years to get the book out. But, we started going through stuff and then again, finding what materials we could. We got lucky. We found a couple of unexpected things. There was a letter from a Lieutenant Barrow, who basically it was a requisition order for what he needed. But not only did he say, I need this many boarding axes, this many, he included a little diagram where he drew a little ship and little stick figures. He was like, this is how I have been repelling boarders, and I found it to be most effective. And this little diagram basically became the way everybody started doing it because it was pretty effective. But we didn't even know that this letter had existed when we started doing the research, and we stumbled across it. And it reinforced what we had kind of found with some of the other research, which felt pretty good, made us feel like we weren't completely out of our minds. And then again, gearing up and doing it. We would do the workshops where we'd have 20 people, break them into teams of 10 in about a 10-foot space. And it's like, this is how much room you have. It's not a big open battlefield. It's like a gang fight in a closet. So good luck not hitting your teammates.
How do we get that? So, was there any kind of arguments, would you say, between the three of you having 100 plus years of experience in training and trying to put everything together?
Not really.
Just because of a philosophy standpoint. Is where I'm
Yeah,
going
and
with
again, that was one of the things. Was I was very lucky in getting in with the whole ISMAC group with Stevie Fick and John Lennox and Jared and that whole community, because we met when we were all in our late 20s, early 30s, and we were really just coming into our own real ideas philosophically of our martial beliefs and who we were as emerging instructors at the time. But we were all so similarly minded. It was like it immediately became a family. And that's why here it is over 20 years later, we still get together every summer for an event, but really just to hang out. We love teaching and we love doing it. But for us, it's our family vacation that we've been taking together for 20 plus years.
Would that be
And
Combat Con?
that's Combat Con now. It used to be ISMAC, now it's Combat Con. And we will always find something, even if Combat Con ends, we've already talked, we will find something for us to all get together, because it's not just the hanging out and that it's the sharing of those ideas. It's the, like I personally have a few new avenues that I've started focusing on that I'm excited to when we all get together and say, hey, this is what I've been working on, check this out. And, that's the thing is we'll get together and, there will be times I'll have ideas or interpretations and they'll be like, I don't think so. I think it's this. And, we're able to do this wonderful skill that people used to have where we have the ability to agree to disagree and continue
Shocking,
on.
isn't it?
Yes. And continue on with our conversation. And that's the thing. It's like all of us are kind of in that mindset that we're always still hungry to learn and do more. We're always still like passionate enough that it hasn't become what's the next hobby for us. It's like, this is what we do. It's as much as a part of who we are. I brought that into the Hollywood side of things to where, I hyper focus in a very specialized field out here, looking at the things that I do and keeping things on a, much more realistic scale. But at my passion has always been this, the martial cultures, like understand not so much what the technique is, but why.
Mm-hmm. And I compare it to like golf. Yeah, that as far as there's never, you're always learning, if that makes sense. That there's not one way to skin a cat, if that makes sense. And you're
Right.
always learning.
And that's one of the things that the colonel was always quick to be somebody to adapt new things. The core of the Macklemore fighting system, that was kind of the term that I've applied to all of his stuff. He did his series of books, and he just, the company that he was publishing them through, like he had, more esoteric ideas for titles, but they were like, no, let's just call it Bowie and Big Knife Fighting. And he was like, fine. And he went with that, but then he started the fighting series. So it's, the Fighting Tomahawk, the Fighting Gladiator. And each of these were areas that it was his personal passion. That's kind of what defined what he did. And it was the Tomahawk and things like that he was really known for that I've carried on. But we did a lot of different things. And a lot of his students, I have a lot of them, but some of the other students, we have all of these unfinished manuscripts that are, some of them are 10 pages, some of them are like 5 pages, or just a series of sketches that he would do. Because the artwork is another thing that drew people to his books. And he would draw all these because they created a feeling of movement that you just don't get with photographs. And a lot of people I know bought his books just for the artwork alone. So we continue that idea of what is going to be the next thing. He had the whole idea built around what he called the circle of steel, with the idea that there was a progression of weapons where obviously you start with a shorter weapon, then go to a longer weapon as you get better control. And then you add multiple weapons in and, dual weapons and things like that as your martial skill increased. But you're always constantly going around that circle, because every time you think you know something about one weapon, there's always a new element to throw in, but there's also that opportunity to now start to focus on a different weapon or a different style. There's that saying that a lot of people will talk out that will criticize kind of jumping from style to style, where it's like, jack of all trades is a master of none, but people don't realize that's only half of that saying. The
Yeah, the
actual
William
quote,
Shakespeare.
yeah, the actual quote it ends with, but still is a master, or still is better than a master of only one. The idea being, yeah, you never will master anyone's style, but like Bruce Lee used to say, kind of talk about if you can master enough of a certain style to get what's best of it and understand the core mechanics of it, then you can understand how to defend against it. And, for the Colonel, that was always his main thing is like, gear up and go. And, if it consistently does not work, it's not a valid technique. It's not going to work in a high threat, high stress situation of combat. So he had a very real world approach to that, but he was a big advocate for people continuing to look at different things. There were areas that I continue to pursue, like longsword, that he had done his time with longsword. To him, it didn't call to him. It didn't speak to him, as he would say. So he moved on to different things. One of the things that we were working on that I'm still tweaking and finishing up, we were working on a book on Viking combatives, which, again, years of research, and it goes pretty deep. He even looked at, does a brief overview of Viking boarding actions when they would come up to each other. So he had a broad variety of things that he was interested in, but he always believed in approaching it with that same grounded theory. Do your research, exhaustive research. When you think you can't possibly do any more research, do more research. And that was the core principle for the School of Two Swords, and keeping everything what he felt as close to true as we could get it.
So, mentioned stunt coordinating and stuff like that earlier. So, what is Space Command, a TV series?
So, basically, I came out here wanting to get into doing stunts and fight choreography and all of that in the film industry. And I've done okay with it. I did about what I expected to. Stayed at the independent level. A few years ago, I got involved in this sci-fi project called Space Command, which is basically, it is an independent sci-fi series that is developed in very much the same vibe of the sci-fi TV shows of the 90s and early 2000s, with a little bit of like the late 80s vibe. So, like the later episodes of Star Trek, the Babylon 5, that type of feel. But they're all completely independently produced, written, directed by a guy named Mark Zicree, who was a writer for TV for years. And this is like, this was his sci-fi idea since he was a kid. I got involved a few years ago, starting with the second film, as the stunt coordinator and fight choreographer, and then ended up playing one of the alien races, where I have a fight sequence with John Hennigan. He's a professional wrestler. He plays like a battle android. He and I square off, and I have to do the entire fight on stilts. So that was a whole new learning sequence for me. But I basically come on with them moving from just doing stunt coordinator to sort of helping with like production and more behind the scenes, as well as continuing to do the stunt work, but now just helping out with more production work as well. So they just put the first, even though it's a film, it's really, if you watch it thinking you're watching just a bunch of TV shows back to back, it gives you a better idea of the feel for it.
That's why I said TV series. So
yeah, and it really is. Even though it's marketed as a film, it really is a TV series, and that's how I usually talk about it. And that's on Amazon now. We just finished filming the second one, and we're going into production on the third one. But then there's a couple of other projects that they're working on as well that I'm coming on board with. So it's been fun. It's allowed me to get a crash course in learning some different elements of the film and entertainment industry that I would have had to pay a lot of money to take for in a course somewhere, as far as getting more production and expanding behind the camera beyond just like stunt coordinating and fight choreography.
and you mentioned John there. And I know who he is. It's scary how athletic and everything else that he is, isn't it?
It is. So he actually, up until he recently moved, but he lived just a couple of streets down from me, and he and I were doing just like some personal training back and forth because we wanted to get some sword work and all of that. And when we were working the previs for this fight, we were going through things and just watching a guy of his size move and then bounce around the way he can.
So graceful.
This is to amaze me. Yeah.
He's just so graceful how he moves. Yeah. It's scary.
But you look at him and he's a big guy. Like you don't appreciate how big he is until you're standing there getting ready to fight him. And, you're like, this guy is just a big dude. But then he moves and you're like, how is he moving this quick? So, yeah, it was so much fun. I sent a clip to my girlfriend, and she was just killing herself laughing back when we were doing the previs for it, where he scoops me up basically and chucks me. And we were doing it at this gym where we had a ball pit to practice the throw. And it's just, it's like I'm nothing, like I'm a stuffed animal. Just sends me sailing through the air.
Yeah, he's a guy with size, but also would remind people, say, who I'll reference, Benny the Jet, where there's that just dance element, but grace to how everything's done.
And he's just, he's a good argument for people that say, well, if you get that much muscle mass, you lose flexibility and speed. No, because the guy he's super flexible and he's really smooth. And, the fact that he's, a professional wrestler, he's great to work with because he picks up choreo right away. And then, he can start to give feedback, and it's like, well, you could do this, this, and this. Well, let's work all of this into there and all of that. And it's like working with people like that. I love it because then it's no longer work to me. It's like, well, this, because to me, it's about the storytelling aspect. Like, I'm not one of those guys that comes in and I want to do the most hyper realistic, gritty, brutal fight. It's like, yeah, if the fight needs that, if that's the tone of the movie, but if you're telling a story and it's non-human characters and the whole vibe of the story has this kind of serious but fun entertainment, let's ramp it up. It's like let's throw some stuff in there. And it was such a fun time working with him.
Well, Steve, I appreciate the time. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, this is Anthony DeLongis, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.